fourth graders. So we're back for some more Farmer Boy. We're going to be reading 3 more chapters this week. I was just kind of counting it out. We might have to add an extra chapter starting in June. We'll probably end up doing 4 chapters a week just so we can get everything in before the end of school year, because I want you to be able to finish the whole book, obviously. So we're going to be reading Farmer Boy by Laura Ingalls Wilder, and instead of you like staring at my face, I thought I would just do it like this. So please have your book with you so that way you can follow along. So we're going to start with the turn of the year. So we had finished talking about how he was breaking the calves, right? And then he had to learn that he needs to stay in the barnyard and work with them instead of before he brings them out into the great wide big world, like they said. So we need to stay in that barnyard. So he learns a lot. Almanzo learns a lot of lessons throughout this book. So now we're at the turn of the year. So this would be like springtime. So this would be like maybe end of February, March, mostly March, maybe early April. The days were growing longer, but the cold was more intense. Father said, when the days begin to lengthen, the cold begins to strengthen. At last the snow softened a little on the south and west slopes. At noon the icicles dripped. Sap was rising in the trees, and it was time to make sugar. In the cold mornings just before sunrise, Almanzo and Father set out to the maple grove. Father had a big wooden yoke on his shoulders, and Almanzo had a little yoke. And that's what this is right here. This is a yoke. It goes over your shoulders, and then it's easier to carry these buckets. So that way you're not carrying them in your hands. So your shoulders, which are stronger and can hold this, the weight of it a lot better. From the ends of the yokes hung strips of moosewood bark with large iron hooks on them, and the big wooden bucket swung from each hook. In every maple tree, Father had bored a small hole and fitted a little wooden spout into it. Sweet maple sap was dripping from the spouts into small pails. And remember, like if you've ever noticed, we have a lot of people who collect sap up in the North Country, up around here, because we have a lot of maple trees. And they collect their sap. Many people collect their sap through that tube, the plastic tubing, or maybe sacks. But back then they didn't have that technology, so they would just bore a hole, make a hole in the wood, in the tree, and they would put a little spout in it, and then they would hang a bucket from it to collect the sap. Going from tree to tree, Almanzo emptied the sap into his big buckets. The weight hung from his shoulders, but he steadied the buckets with his hands to keep them from swinging. When they were full, he went to the great cauldron and emptied them into it. So the great cauldron is this big metal bucket, for a different, not for a better word, or to try to find a better word for it. I wish I could, but it's big and it's metal, and they pour, and it's over a stove, or not a stove, a fire. And they're right out in the woods, and that's where they're going to boil the sap, because you have to boil the sap in order to make the maple sugar that they're going to be using. And I don't know if you've ever noticed, if you have had real maple syrup, if you don't put your cap on tightly, or if you have some of the maple syrup that kind of stays around the outside, it ends up crystallizing. That's maple sugar, and that's what they're making. It's kind of how maple candy is made. It's if it's left out in the air after it's boiled, it's going to turn hard and turn into sugar. But if you keep it in a bucket, or if you keep it in a closed container, it will stay liquid. So this was easier. White sugar was very expensive, and they had to buy it in the stores. And I mean, they had some white sugar, but Mother pretty much predominantly used brown sugar, or the maple sugar, when she was doing most of her cooking, because the white sugar was so expensive. So this was an easy way for them to make it, and it was cheap. The huge cauldron hung from a pole set between 2 trees. Father kept a bonfire blazing under it to boil the sap. Almanzo loved trudging through the frozen wild woods. He walked on snow that had never been walked on before, and only his tracks followed behind him. Busily he emptied the little pails into the buckets, and whenever he was thirsty, he drank some of the thin, sweet, icy cold sap. He liked to go back to the roaring fire. He poked it and saw sparks fly. He warmed his face and hands in the scorching heat and smelled the sap boiling. Then he went into the woods again. At noon all the sap was boiling in the cauldron. Father opened the lunch pail, and Almanzo sat on the log beside him. They ate and talked. Their feet were stretched out to the fire, and a pile of logs was at their backs. All around them were snow and ice and wild woods, but they were snug and cozy. After they had eaten, Father stayed by the fire to watch the sap, but Almanzo hunted wintergreen berries. Under the snow on the south slopes, the bright red berries were ripe among their thick green leaves. Almanzo took off his mittens and pawed away the snow with his bare hands. He found the red clusters and filled his mouth full. The cold berries crunched between his teeth, gushing out their aromatic juice. Nothing else was ever so good as wintergreen berries dug out of the snow. Almanzo's clothes were covered with snow. His fingers were stiff and red with cold, but he never left a south slope until he had pawed it all over. When the sun was low behind the maple trunks, Father threw snow on the fire, and it died in sizzles and steam. Then Father dipped the hot syrup into buckets. He and Almanzo set their shoulders under the yokes again and carried the buckets home. Now, you need a lot of sap to make a small amount of syrup. So they're going to do this for many days. The sap will run as long as it stays cool at night, or cold at night, and warm and sunny during the day. So for a certain amount of time, the sap will run. So every day they'll be going out to gather the sap until there's no more sap to gather to make their maple sugar. They poured the syrup into Mother's big brass kettle on the cook stove. Then Almanzo began the chores while Father fetched the rest of the syrup from the woods. After supper, the syrup was ready to sugar off. So it stayed on the stove cooking this whole time. And then after dinner, it was ready to sugar off, meaning Mother's going to pour it in some pans so it makes these cakes of sugar, basically. Mother ladled it into 6-quart milk pans and left it to cool. In the morning, every pan held a big cake of solid maple sugar. Mother dumped out the round, golden brown cakes and stored them on the top pantry shelves. Day after day, the sap was running, and every morning, Almanzo went with Father to gather and boil it. Every night, Mother sugared it off. They made all the sugar that they could use next year. So you're going to notice they do a lot of preparation for the whole year. When it's time to sugar, that's pretty much all they do, that and chores, obviously, but so that way they can make enough for the whole year. Most of the things they do are so they can have stores of it, meaning they have a lot of it in storage in their home to save to be used throughout the whole year. And they kind of know how much they're going to use, so they know how much they need to make for the year. Then the last boiling of syrup was not sugared off. It was stored in jugs down cellar, and that was the year's syrup. So remember I said if they didn't put it out so that the air would crystallize it and they left it in the jug, it would stay liquid, and then they could have maple syrup as well. When Alice came home from school, she smelled Almanzo and she cried out, "Oh, you've been eating wintergreen berries!" She thought it wasn't fair that she had to go to school while Almanzo gathered sap and ate wintergreen berries. She said, "Boys have all the fun." But she made Almanzo promise that he wouldn't touch the south slopes along Trout River beyond the sheep pasture. So on Saturdays they went together to paw over those slopes. When Almanzo found a red cluster, he yelled, and when Alice found one, she squealed, and sometimes they divided, and sometimes they didn't. But they went on their hands and knees all over those south slopes, and they ate wintergreen berries all afternoon. Almanzo brought home a pail full of the thick green leaves, and Alice crammed them into a big bottle. Mother filled the bottle with whiskey and set it away. That was her wintergreen flavoring for cakes and cookies. So just like you might use vanilla extract or almond extract or different flavorings like that, that's what they're doing with this wintergreen flavoring. So it can give their cakes and cookies just a little bit of a different flavor if they want. Every day the snow was melting a little. The cedars and spruces shook it off, and it fell in blobs from the bare branches of oaks and maples and beeches. All along the walls of barns and house the snow was pitted with water falling from the icicles, and finally the icicles fell crashing. The earth showed in wet, dark patches here and there. The patches spread. Only the trodden paths were still white, and a little snow remained on the north sides of buildings and wood piles. Then the winter term of school ended, and spring had come. So remember, when the winter term ends, Mr. Corse will go back to his family or back to where he was from, and then he'll come back again when they're ready to start school again. But springtime is when the farms are the busiest. So they're going to need to have all hands on deck. All the kids are going to need to stay home so they can help do the planting and getting the fields ready, and so that way they can make sure that they're going to have enough crops for the year. One morning, Father drove to Malone. Before noon, he came hurrying home and shouted the news from the buggy. The New York potato buyers were in town. Royal ran to help hitch the team to the wagon. Alice and Almanzo ran to get bushel baskets from the woodshed. They rolled them bumpity-bump down the cellar stairs and began filling them with potatoes as fast as they could. They filled 2 baskets before Father drove the wagon to the kitchen porch. Then the race began. Father and Royal hurried the baskets upstairs and dumped them into the wagon, and Almanzo and Alice hurried to fill more baskets faster than they were carried away. Almanzo tried to fill more baskets than Alice, but he couldn't. She worked so fast that she was turning back to the bin while her hoop skirts were still whirling the other way. When she pushed back her curls, her hands left smudges on her cheeks. Almanzo laughed at her dirty face, and she looked at him. Well, look at yourself in the glass. You're dirtier than I be. They kept the baskets full. Father and Royal never had to wait. When the wagon was full, Father drove away in a hurry. It was mid-afternoon before he came back, but Royal and Almanzo and Alice filled the wagon again. While he ate some cold dinner, and he hauled another load away. That night, Alice helped Royal and Almanzo do the chores. Father was not there for supper. He did not come before bedtime. Royal sat up to wait for him. Late in the night, Almanzo heard the wagon, and Royal went out to help Father curry and brush the tired horses, who had done 20 miles of hauling that day. The next morning and the next, they all began loading by candlelight, and Father was gone with the first load before sunrise. On the 3rd day, there's that magic 3, right? There's that again and again. On the 3rd day, the potato train left for New York City, but all Father's potatoes were on it. 500 bushels at $1 a bushel, he said to Mother at supper. I told you when potatoes were cheap last fall that they'd be high in the spring. So their crops, some of them they did sell so they could make money as well. So they would make sure that they had enough for themselves, but then the extra they would sell. And in this case, the potatoes were going to New York City. They were going to the potato buyers in New York City. So he knew when to sell them to get the best price. That was $500 in the bank. They were all proud of Father, who raised good potatoes and knew so well when to store them and when to sell them. That's pretty good, Mother said, beaming. They all felt happy. But later, Mother said, well, now that's off our hands. We'll start house cleaning tomorrow, bright and early. So this is where you get the phrase spring cleaning. That's what they would do back then. They would clean all the time, but not the big clean, right? Where you would take things off and you would wash everything and you would make sure everything was scoured really well. And that's what they were going to do, is all hands on deck again to make sure the house got clean. But Almanzo, he hated house cleaning. He had to pull up carpet tacks all around the edges of miles of carpet. Then the carpets were hung on clotheslines outdoors, and he had to beat them with a long stick. So they do not have vacuum cleaners. Why? Because they don't have electricity. They weren't invented yet. So their carpets are basically just nailed down at the corners. And so every spring they take the tacks up, they hang the carpet outside, and they beat it with a stick. That's how they get all the dust out of it. And then they're going to bring it back in. When he was little, he had run under the carpets playing. They were tents, but now he was 9 years old. He had to beat those carpets without stopping till no more dust would come out of them. Everything in the house was moved. Everything was scrubbed and scoured and polished. All the curtains were down. All the feather beds were outside airing. All the blankets and quilts were washed. From dawn to dark, Almanzo was running, pumping water, fetching wood, spreading clean straw on the scrubbed floors, and then helping to stretch the carpets over it, and then tacking all those edges down again. So they didn't have like a carpet pad. Usually in between your carpet and the hard floor is a pad. So they would use straw. So they would wash the floor really good, lay down the fresh straw, and then they would put the carpet back down and then tack it down tight again, and then it would stay that way until the next spring when they would do the cleaning again. Days and days he spent in the cellar. He helped Royal empty the vegetable bins. They sorted out every spoiled apple and carrot and turnip and put back the good ones into a few bins that Mother had scrubbed. They took down the other bins and stored them in the woodshed. They carried out crocks and jars and jugs till the cellar was almost empty. Then Mother scrubbed the walls and floor. Royal poured water into pails of lime, and Almanzo stirred the lime till it stopped boiling and was whitewash. Then they whitewashed the whole cellar. That was fun. So whitewashing is like painting. So they washed it, Mother scrubbed it really good, and then the kids whitewashed it to make it all nice and clean. Mercy on us, Mother said when they came upstairs. Did you get as much whitewash on the cellar as you got on yourselves? The whole cellar was fresh and clean and snow white when it dried. Mother moved her milk pans down to the scrub shelves. The butter tubs were scoured white with sand and dried in the sun, and Almanzo set them in a row on the clean cellar floor to be filled with the summer's butter. Outdoors, the lilacs and the snowball bushes were in bloom. Violets and buttercups were blossoming in the green pastures. Birds were building their nests, and it was time to work in the fields. So that's what they did at the turn of the year. They're getting everything ready. So now the next chapter, we're going to see what they do when it's time to work in the fields. All right. I hope you're enjoying it. See you soon.